Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ozymandias Project. Trireme Transit, the newest and most reliable state-of-the-art time-traveling transportation service, is now boarding for all new and returning passengers. Now departing, present ponderings. Next stop is ancient Odyssey.
Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 15 of the podcast. This week, I had a really fun and interesting chat with Dr. Brooke Holmes, the Robert F. Goheen Professor in the Humanities and Professor of Classics at Princeton University. Her areas of specialization encompass ancient Greek medicine and life science, ancient philosophy, Greek literature, especially Homer and tragedy, Lucretius, reception studies, literary theory, medical humanities and bioethics, environmental humanities, gender and sexuality studies, and 20th century French philosophy. Together, we dove headfirst into the origins of medical ethics and how it impacts our approach to the COVID-19 pandemic, had an honest conversation about the experience of being a woman in the classics, and discussed Dr. Holmes' approach to classics as a form of world building. It was a real joy to be able to speak with such an accomplished scholar who not only excels in her profession, but also has a real passion for mentoring young academics and building a supportive community of the classics both within and outside the field. This conversation could have gone on far longer, but alas, all good things must come to an end. And with that, enjoy the episode, and I will speak to you all next time. Thank you for joining me today. I know it's Friday and it's been busy, so I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
I want to jump right in and ask you a little bit about how you got into classics. I'm sure there's for most people I found who've been on the podcast, it's always a really fun and entertaining story, just because there's no right way to get into the field. So.
Absolutely. And I think in my case, it's a particularly circuitous route. So I went to college at Columbia, and I had wanted to work for the State Department. I had done debate in high school. I was going to do Russian. I had some French from high school. And then I was in the Corps and I started doing literature humanities. And I just, I decided I wanted to do literature. I fell in love with literature. But I decided I didn't want to do Russian literature. I wanted to do comparative literature. And I decided this towards the end, I guess, of my first year. And the complet program at Columbia had pretty tough prerequisites. So you had to have, I think, 2 years of 2 languages. And so I was doing the Russian and I didn't want to keep doing French. I don't know. I guess I could have. It would have looked really different. And I found intensive Greek as something I could do 2 years in one. It was the only language program that I thought I could get the prerequisites for complet in time. So that was the reason I signed up for ancient Greek. And I did Hansen and Quinn. I did, we call it Turbo Greek at Princeton. But at Columbia, you actually can do intensive intermediate Greek as well. So you can do a 2-year sequence in 1 year. So that's what I did. But I actually continued to do complet, was doing Russian and Greek, traveled in the former Soviet Union after I finished at Columbia, and then went to grad school in complet. And meanwhile, I had realized that I would probably keep doing classics, or I thought that if I didn't want to do Russian and Greek as a comparative thing, I should pick up Latin. So I taught myself Latin while working at the Ministry of the Interior in Estonia on an internship. Well, I guess that was right. It was after Columbia. So I got to Princeton and I had kind of a little bit of Latin, a little bit of Greek, and then realized that I wanted to focus on ancient stuff. But all my degrees are in comparative literature. At one point, I went to Paris to do a DEA, which is kind of like a master's in études grecques, because I wanted to stay in comparative literature. And I think I'm really a comparatist at heart. So I didn't really identify as a classicist or think of myself as a classicist till it was time to go on the job market. And the process to getting tenure was, in a way, I think, my experience of the field and sort of what it meant to professionalize. But I've always felt like a real outsider in classics because of the way I came to it. And so I've always been interested in the kinds of conventions of the discipline, like seeing it almost anthropologically sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's really amazing. When I was in school, I took some ancient Greek just to graduate. I did not have the courage to start Latin, which because I transferred over some AP French credit, I didn't
Yeah.
have to take it. So I got very lucky and I just ended up taking a semester or two of ancient Greek in school. But that's really, really cool. That's one of the more unique paths that I think I've heard, for sure, for sure. And then, so once you kind of found your way into classics, how did you pick your areas of interest? There when I was reading up on them, I found that they were really wide, um, a wide variety of them. I think I saw some medicine sprinkled in there. Of course, reception studies are a huge part of the field. And then I think I saw some gender and sexuality studies in there as well.
Yeah, I had a kind of fateful fall term in my second year of graduate school, and I took from a Zeitlin's tragedy class, I was taking Gayatri Spivak's class on post-structuralism at Columbia. I had studied with Gayatri Spivak as an undergraduate, and then I took Heinrich von Statten was teaching ancient medicine. And so in that term, it sort of all came together. I became obsessed with symptoms, and I became obsessed with the symptom at a kind of moment of the limits of what was the kind of end of the linguistic turn. And so I was imagining ways in which we would talk about, the body speaks, but I was interested in how signifying practices happen in bodies that aren't the same as language, that manifest forms of meaning that aren't tied to human meaning making, so to speak. So that was a key moment for me. And that's how my dissertation research eventually started to develop around the figure of the symptom, and became the basis of my first book. The book, which is about the idea of the physical body, by which I mean a body that has a nature, a physis, and how that concept comes to take shape in 5th century medical writing. And I was particularly interested in how the space from which symptoms were imagined to emerge changes from a daimonic space, a space of gods who may intervene in your sort of intentionality in good and bad ways, how that space of the symptom changes to be the inside of the body. And that the notion of the physical body first starts to take shape around this kind of non-conscious interior that's not accessible to consciousness or intentionality, but has these forces within it that are associated with the humors or whatever elemental stuffs. And when things go wrong, all of a sudden they surface as pain. And so the book that I wrote that came out of the dissertation turned on this idea of imagining the symptom as a mechanism for a site of interpretation that could invite people to imagine new worldviews. And so it was an attempt to really think about how another worldview around suffering and culpability and ethics was emerging in relationship to this new way of reading symptoms. And so that's why the first book was very invested in the concept of the body. And I guess when I look at my research interests, I know, often people think, well, you're sort of all over the place. And I really see my work as guided by a set of questions around the history of concepts, and the concepts that are so embedded in the ways that we make sense of the world, our ontology, we might say, that we almost don't think of them as having histories, or we don't think of them being parts of the mental furniture that could be removed and that humans could imagine things otherwise. Or we imagine, there's the old paradigms of, well, yeah, people could think mythically, but we think of those mythic forms of thought as just not having reason. I mean, that still persists. And I was really interested in other forms of world making in response to symptoms, in response to, now I'm doing this course on nature, where these are really robust forms of world making that can help us provincialize or localize a way of thinking that's organized around concepts like body or nature or matter. So I'm really interested in the long history of the physical body, the long history of concepts of nature, the long history of materialism from a philosophical point of view, but from a philosophical point of view, that these are problems that are ethical problems, or political problems, or problems that never get solved. They're sites of continued contestation, and that's why I continue to be interested in literary texts and artworks and things that continue to work with the kinds of problems generated by these concepts over many many centuries.
That's really cool. I don't think I've ever had a professor approach things that way, so I would find it really interesting to sit in on a class and see how you approach it. So I have to ask, just because the thought popped into my mind, and it's kind of stupid, but as someone who kind of studies concepts, but also I'm assuming you've had to read a lot on actual just how the ancients studied and conceived of medicine in their own time. Do you find yourself at any point, if something's going on, or if something's going on with someone you know, instead of going to WebMD, can you just say, "Oh, let me try to diagnose this like an ancient. Okay, what are your symptoms? Just tell me, without any of the modern stuff."
Yeah. It's funny because sometimes I joke. I mean, I do have a lot of pre-med students in my classes, and my biological medical knowledge is very limited. I mean, sometimes you get people who study ancient medicine who are trained physicians, and, particularly the anatomy. And that's not me. I don't have a medical background, although I did do work in modern bioethics, which I could talk about. But yeah, so especially when I first started, I mean, the logic of the kind of humoral body is fascinating, and it would be, there's a lot of, I mean, it's not so different. Like, did I eat too much and I didn't exercise enough to burn it off? Or, did I have too much of one acidic thing and that's sort of setting me off? I mean, there's a real anxiety around fluidity and kind of the liquid body that I find interesting, that like imagining things are going wrong because you're somehow not holding on to the form of the body. I mean, it's Aristotelian, but it's also very Hippocratic. I mean, it's very embedded in the ancient notion of the body.
And how has, if it has at all, the pandemic that we are currently living in, has that sort of influenced or changed the way you sort of think about medicine, ancient medicine?
I mean, it just reminds me, I mean, so I guess I'm interested in the ways in which ethical problems around disease and responsibility for disease in Greek and Roman medical texts are resonant with problems that we have around these questions. I'm very interested in the question of blame. And when things go wrong, we need to find people to be held responsible for that. And one of the ways that, we used to talk about the story of a kind of conventional way of talking about the rise of Greek medicine is, okay, there's no gods, and now we're going to secularize it, as if we could move to a world of science where, it's just the facts, like just the science, no politics, no ethics. And obviously in the midst of the pandemic, this is abundantly true, that there is no science in a vacuum. Science is, politicized. We're obsessed with questions of morality and individual agency, and all of this becomes more and more evident. But this is something that I could see in the Greek text, that I was incredibly interested in the formation of Greek medicine, not just as a site for, new diagnoses of disease, but the production of like a new person, a new subject. And that subject is in a way produced because you have this body that's responsible for making you sick, or things within it. And we have texts, we have a great text that I like called On the Techniques, and the body and the opacity of the body, the fact you can't see inside the body, it's these caverns and things go wrong, and it's the symptom always comes too late. The way they theorize disease is a lot like the way we I think in our imaginary, we think of cancer, like the symptoms come and it's stage 4 and it's too late, like because the body is sort of a hidden space that may betray you. So the body is at fault, but the body is a material object. It's an object, it's not human. And so it doesn't absorb blame very easily. And so what you start to see happening is the formation of the person whose body it is, who comes to be held responsible for taking care of it. And this is where you start to see the creation of a new kind of ethical subject. This ethical subject is being formed in late 5th century Athens as male and as free. And so there's a lot of anxiety about enslavement and about femininity as the conditions in which you don't want to be in as a citizen, and that would imperil your sense of control over yourself, your autarky. And so the body is a way of imagining the femininity or the passivity, the lack of agency associated with enslavement within yourself. So you start to see why the body becomes part of the imaginary of these cultures in a negative way, because it's the thing that has to be controlled. So medicine posits itself as a site of control. Philosophy comes along and says, hey, you can control the body, but you really got to control the soul. Why is this interesting? So for the pandemic, a couple things. The pandemic is a site where we're having a lot of blame, and people want to hold people responsible for things that are going wrong. Whether, if you get COVID, it's your own fault, or, the people who are holding up structures, are being held responsible. And in many cases they are, but I think what we're really looking at is a structural breakdown in the political system, in our public health system, because of a lack of resources. It's not to say there aren't people who should, act differently or so on and so forth, but in the face of massive inability to sort of diagnose these structural problems and address them, you see again the ways in which, we problematize people's, individuals for becoming sick or trying to find sites of blame. And that's something that's, I think, not just in the pandemic, but kind of anywhere, because, American society is very much focused on individual agency and, you're responsible to be thin and healthy and pretty and all of these things. And if you're not, it's a moral failing. And if you, fall ill, you have comorbidities, you're poor, it must be your fault. This is deeply built into the kind of American ethos in really problematic ways. And you can see similar things going on in the Greek period when the body emerges. So when you have a system like this, they don't have a very good way of talking about contagion, because contagion, there are a lot of different reasons. One would be it looks sort of religious, but really it's also that they can't handle it very well because they're used to dealing with bodies. And they also want to hold people responsible. So Galen, for example, doesn't really have, he's working later than the Hippocratic writers, but he doesn't have a theory of contagion really, because he's like, okay, you have 10 people in a crowded theater and it's really hot. They're open air theaters and 2 people get heat stroke. Well, the heat didn't cause it, because not everybody got sick. It must be those 2 people. There must be something wrong with their bodies. There must be a pre-existing condition. And then he wants to moralize that pre-existing condition as the real cause of why people fell ill. And so I think this kind of dynamic around, let's try to find things that aren't just the randomness. And then when we do find them, let's not fault structural reasons, or let's not look at structural racism or, poverty. Let's try to moralize it. These are dynamics we're seeing around the pandemic now that, to me, are echoed by what we see in the ancient writers. The last thing I'll say is that when I was teaching my medicine class last spring, we talk a lot about power and knowledge and physicians and patients. And I do talk a lot about the patient perspective is lost in a lot of Hippocratic texts. The physicians and people writing these texts are obsessed with control and technique and control of the body. It was really difficult in a way to be teaching this in New York in March when we were really in crisis and we were a community in crisis, and frontline healthcare workers, doctors, nurses were not only exhausted and putting themselves at risk, but I think experiencing a kind of moral crisis because they couldn't treat people. They didn't know. They were in the face of not knowing what this new disease was, how to save people. And that sense of impotence, which is something that I think the medical texts are constantly trying to find agency for techne and power. And we want to believe biomedicine can save us. And watching, doctors caught in the limits of medicine in that moment and teaching it was really transformative for how I was thinking about what's sometimes called the moral injury that we impose on doctors when we put them in systems and hold them responsible for things they can't control.
Yeah. I can't imagine what it would be like. I've been in Chicago the whole time throughout the pandemic, but my sister lives in New York, so we would hear snippets of what was going on early on. So it was really tough to hear. So I could only imagine. But I'm glad you brought up this sort of idea of ethics in medicine. It's something that's every medical student has to take like a medical ethics course at some point. And I think everyone in nursing does as well. I don't remember the specifics, but I have had friends in the medical profession kind of running with that medical ethics theme. It seems like anyone who studied ancient medicine and ancient philosophy would also be, in terms of just the practical applicability in today's society, it seems like that would be a really good fit. So you could almost teach medical ethics yourself, even if it's not strictly an ancient course. Is there a lot of crossover there with the modern way we teach sort of medical ethics? And, what does it mean to take the Hippocratic Oath then versus now? Mm-hmm. Is there any crossover there, or am I reaching?
No, it's a really hard question because I mentioned I had this New Directions Fellowship about 4 years ago from Mellon, and part of it was to train more systematically in the history of science and medicine. And then part of it was I wanted to do bioethics. I wanted to see what this field was like. And it is a niche field in medical schools. It's often taught, in a kind of legal way. And in a quite narrowly conceived way as a field, it really comes into being after World War II. And I went to NYU at the time. They were one of the few programs that had their bioethics in the general, kind of humanities and social sciences, where it was closely affiliated with their philosophy department. And I think it's since moved to the School of Public Health. But I wanted a more philosophical approach. But I was asking this question, like, how does one train to be like a bioethicist? And what I learned was a couple things. I mean, I have some training in analytical philosophy just because I work on ancient philosophical texts, and the analytic approach tends to be predominant, because I have a lot of training in continental philosophy as well. And one thing, I found real limits to the way that analytic philosophy was coming up with these problems in bioethics. I think that I resisted some of the notions of the subject and the kind of rational subject. I thought there was like a lingering sort of Platonism around the idea of what it means to be a kind of rational agent. I mean, I got most interested when we were looking at quandaries of agency and what is it called? There's a name for it when it's not compromised agency, but when you have patients making decisions who may not be completely, their mental health may be impaired, or they may be temporarily impaired. And so it's like there are issues around consent. If you're a person who is mentally ill and you're medicated, like, are you your true self when you're medicated? I mean, these are questions that are incredibly interesting to me. So I think the process of doing this training, and I just took a couple courses, so I didn't do the whole master's, was that I thought bioethics is a really weird field, because if we're thinking about the ethics of being in bodies, whether, within medicine or not, it helped me realize, like, we're all like, there's no field you can train in to answer those questions. Like, medical humanities is an expansive way of thinking about it. Disability studies has become important for focalizing questions, not from the physician's point of view, or, who gets the organ transfer, but like, what does it mean to be in a medical system as a person with a disability in an ableist system? So there's a lot of different sites. And in fact, there's a lot of tension, I would say, in medical humanities as it expands between different fields, between medical ethics as it's been traditionally taught, medical humanities as an appendage in medical schools, disability studies. And so a couple things that I learned was, there's like this narrow field, and then there's this really big field. And actually, it's not just a question of my own expertise in ancient medicine, which I do teach as a kind of ethics class. I just actually, I have a student just wrote to me and we were talking about this, and it's a history class, but it counts as an ethical and moral thought class, because we're essentially saying, what I say to my students is, we could go to Greek medicine as the site of, the beginning of clinical medicine, or the oath. So people would think, the oath is the site for imagining deontology, like how one should be a doctor. So bioethics traditionally conceived. And it's been used in that way. It was used in Roe versus Wade, actually. But I say I'm not doing either of those things. Like, I want to think about the whole complex of the problem, that in a medicine of the physical body, you have a fundamental paradox. And that fundamental paradox is that the patient is an object and a subject. The patient is a body, and they don't understand their bodies intuitively. Like, I don't understand my whole body. If I get sick, I may not know why, I may not be able to treat it. Like, the existence of medicine is a response to the paradox that we're alienated at some basic level from our bodies. But I'm also a person. I'm also an agent. I also don't want to be treated like an object. And so that paradox it's a problem we're never going to solve as long as we have a medicine of the body. And so I teach it really as an ethics class, as working through problems that are still with us through texts that are in ways formative of the terms and vocabularies that continue to be used within this long tradition, from the Hippocratics to Galen, and then, through the Arabic tradition and the Syriac, and into the medical schools in the Latin West, as well as eastward to India. I mean, it's hugely diasporic Greek medicine. But so part of it is the genealogy of this tradition in a really rich sense, and in not a genetic sense, but in a sense of, this is a long tradition that's still informing ways medicine is done. But also as a site that's different from today. So it's the differences are places where we can get an angle out, get out of our own myopia and see the world we inhabit a little bit differently. So I see the kind of ethical project in those terms. The last thing I'll say that is amazing is that you can actually do medical ethics like as volunteer work. And so one exciting thing after I took the course at NYU is I started working with Joe Finns, who's the head bioethicist at Weill Cornell. And we have a kind of project that's been put on hold for various reasons around pain. But he had invited me to participate in some of the ethics committee meetings at Weill Cornell. And so I was doing that for a while until I got completely overwhelmed again. And that was amazing for me because I realized that was the kind of bioethics in practical terms that I was looking for when I went to NYU. You've got a room full of 60, 70 people with a case that they need to, they're puzzling through. Maybe there's a policy change, but really they're just trying to, what were the best practices and how would we do it going forward? You've got psychologists, internists, nurses, chaplains, ethicists, really interdisciplinary work. And to me, that was the moment when I was like, this is the kind of bioethics that I want to do. And I want to inform the work I do in the university.
Just a sort of stray observation, because I enjoyed so much that last part. So I actually have 5 doctors in my family. So a lot of doctors. And one of them is my brother-in-law. He, I think he does internal medicine down in Tulsa. And I remember I was talking to him just about, I had an accident and I hurt my back when I was a sophomore in college. Mm-hmm. And long story short, I was on like a billion meds and they just couldn't figure out how to sort of manage my pain. And so I felt like, sort of an object, as you talked about, where I was being poked and prodded and, okay, well, if this doesn't work, let's just throw all this at you and try it. And, that gets really sort of annoying and tiring because you're like, okay, I'm tired of you just trying things like I'm your experiment. Can you just, if you don't know what to do, just tell me and I'll find someone. And I got into a conversation with my brother-in-law after the whole thing had been resolved. And he said something that I've never forgotten to this day, which is, as doctors, we are trained to treat acute pain. So if you come in and you say, I hurt, we're going to give you meds. We're going to try things that take away that pain. But what we are not trained in is treating chronic pain, which is why you see the same people coming back weeks later. Hey, this hurts again. And that's how people get addicted to drugs, because they're not treating the underlying causes. So just sort of that stray observation came back to me. And I thought, wow, this kind of goes hand in hand with the applicability part and just how our systems are set up, what we're doing, what we're looking for, but also just the ethics part of it as well, which is obviously you want to be good people and you want to stop people from hurting. That's great. That's admirable. But if it's getting people hooked onto some really strong drugs, how ethical is it to just keep giving drugs to people if they just keep coming back and not sitting down and trying to actually address that? So it seems like, I think a lot of doctors these days and in medical schools, yes, I think they should really sort of go for a different, more holistic approach to pain. Sort of, I think it would be kind of like the one you're talking about and the one that you have a hand in. I think that might lead to some better outcomes long term, but that's purely speculative at this point. But that's just something that came to mind. Very, very powerful stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge question. Can I just respond really quickly?
Yeah, go ahead.
That's a site where I've thought more about it, I think, since I wrote the book, which is the practice of medicine within what Vivian Nutten calls in the Antiquity, the kind of medical marketplace. But of course, capitalism is really informed, in medical insurance, the medical system today. And so that's both, a site of analogy. And sometimes you can think about what that does to kind of the power of the physician and the patient as a consumer. But I think it's just so amplified in the current context where we're objectified as patients, not just as bodies that are scientific objects, but as billing objects. And so that's where I think, the system of extracting as much money as possible from healthcare, particularly, is going to make acute pain, a kind, or chronic pain, a problem, because the full system of support, whether that means, long-term care or longer-term diagnosis or a network of interlinking therapeutic responses, looking at mental health, looking at, poverty, looking at job stressors, looking at, diet, like all these things just take time. And then they're not valued in a way because they're so expensive if we really put the time into the form of care that's needed. And I think that's where, again, like you mentioned the pandemic. I mean, I was thinking one thing that is so evident in this pandemic is caregiving work is so devalued in this country. It is just devalued, and the country runs on extracting labor from caregivers who are predominantly women, of color. And, it's the thing that keeps the machine going, but it's, not rewarded, it's not recognized. And the authority of the physician is sort of what we hold up, because that's that individual, person who can come in and do the fancy surgery, or come in and treat your acute pain. But we erase all of the caregiving that's required for much more complex problems. And I think in antiquity, sometimes the focus on learned medicine means we don't acknowledge all the forms of caregiving and that kind of work that's going on and isn't surfacing in our texts. And the obsession of the patient as the kind of autarkic individual is mirrored by the physician as like the autarkic individual. The physician is, I've argued, disembodied in these texts. He's a mind, he's a mind who can argue his case and treat your pain and be successful, but who doesn't want to be vulnerable. And I think that does damage to patients. And as I was saying with the pandemic, it does damage to doctors. They have huge rates of burnout, huge rates of suicide. And so it's a problem that's specific to kind of late capitalism. But I think it's interesting to read through a lot of the ancient medical texts because there are resonant moments around this male individualism, the male citizen, the obsession with freedom and not enslavement, that it's feminized. All of that is very resonant.
Yeah. And to bring in sort of the idea that they're here to, especially with these insurance companies in this country, trying to extract every last cent from the people who really need help. So going to the hospital, to the doctor's office is kind of just a nightmare, no matter how you slice it, for pretty much everyone. But it seems like if you get into that sort of aspect of you're being billed, okay, then we talk about the system, the infrastructure we have. What are we going to do about that? It seems like it really has these tendrils that kind of expand into so many other areas of study, so many different careers and professions. I mean, if you don't plan on going into anything like the ancient studies, but you want to be a politician, I'm sure you're going to study sort of history of ancient political thought leading up to through 20th century political thought. And so this idea of maybe requiring everyone in other career fields that will somehow touch on our massive healthcare system, does it seem reasonable that everyone should be required to have some sort of medical humanities course? So, or even if it's not required, is this an aspect that we could, as a field, really talk up and say, hey, did you know that this ancient stuff relates to whatever your career is? So this is a reason you should either take some classes in classics, get the major, even if you don't plan to go into the field. Because when we talk about this sort of limited accessibility and limited knowledge of us as a field, I usually find, because we don't do a very good job of selling ourselves on the practical applicability of, hey, don't just take this because you need the credit, because you literally just need to graduate. You should take this and see it as an opportunity to. Don't be scared to get a background in classics because it'll make you more well-rounded for X, Y, Z, whatever. But I'm just wondering if the medical humanities part should be something we actively talk about more.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, when I went on the job market, 15 years ago, it was not an asset to be doing ancient medicine. I mean, I did tragedy and I got, the jobs I've gotten in my life at that level were pretending I only did tragedy, because ancient medicine was seen as a very marginal field. And that things have changed a lot. Medical humanities are boom industry, and it's good. I do think, it's good and bad. It's bad in the sense that, within the kind of crushing resources of the university, the instrumentalization of the humanities, if they're not really given the space and the respect they need, can become, appendages of the kind of technocratic complex, for sure. But I do think that on the whole, yeah, like everybody should be doing humanities courses. I think this is a moment where I would, want to say the pandemic, climate change, political crisis, like humanists in the broad sense, I mean, need to step up and think, we need to change the kinds of vocabularies that we are giving our students and our publics to work through complicated problems so that we can collectively deliberate on the solutions that we need to complex problems, and not revert to, easy blame or, be effective in critiques when critiques are valid. I think the challenge that I've really faced in coming and working on ancient medicine and thinking about the field, and this links to a lot of the work I've done kind of around like art exhibitions I've done, projects I've run in relationship to the field, is that so Hippocratic texts, Galenic texts, I mean, these are the foundations of traditions that are in place for millennia through, written texts that are handed down, commentaries and so on and so forth. So there are reasons to think about this as part of what we call Western medicine. But since my first book, I've become really much more critical and thoughtful, I think, about how we position classics as relevant to the present, and saying, this is the birthplace of medicine, or, this is like somehow about Western medicine or the genealogy or Western philosophy. And because I think that is very problematic in terms of the kinds of ways it positions the field as, Eurocentric for one thing, as really more and more like allied with whiteness. And it misrepresents what actually this rich tradition is when we're imagining what Greek medicine is as a kind of body of text. So I guess what I would say there is, you have these texts which do emerge in 5th century Greece and start to constitute a canon, which is handed down, read, commented on, and materially transmits this information and becomes sites for new communities of people to study. And so the textual tradition, I think, helps us understand this kind of materiality of reception. We see it in the Babylonian tradition, where you have millennia of cuneiform texts around medicine, and there's the formation of a particular medical tradition around written texts that then also attract philosophical attention, literary attention, and so on and so forth. So that's what we're seeing in the quote unquote in the traditions that descend from ancient Greece and Rome. It's not like it's in our DNA, us Europeans or Westerners or white people or whatever. It's this tradition which is handed down. And part of what that does is it helps to understand, for one thing, I emphasized the Greco-Arabic translation movement in the 9th century in Baghdad, hugely important. And if you focus on medicine and science and classics, you get a really different picture than if you're just doing literature, you're doing Latin literature. The Latin West does not matter that much to the transmission of medicine and science and philosophy. And if we recognize that, like, every classics department should be doing Arabic, should be thinking about the Greco-Arabic, should be thinking about Syriac, should be thinking about Pali. I mean, so already you have a sense in which the story has elided a really important part of this kind of diasporic translation movement that needs to be taken on board. And I think is really important when you talk to students about, what is this tradition that we're all sort of working with? Well, yes, there's biomedicine. If you're pre-med, you're being educated in a system influenced by this. But even culturally, it's so diffuse that it's what Susan Buck-Morss talks about, a kind of communist inheritance of the past. I mean, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about this tradition. It's so diffuse and diasporic, and it's been taken up by so many different communities that we really, I think, need to imagine it as available to us in the present, making these connections and finding value in it, rather than assuming that value is just given to us as by a tradition, which may or may not be ours.
Yeah, I think those are all really, really good points. And I think I would have found it really interesting to have my classics department say, hey, we're going to introduce some elements of, Arabic tradition over here. Let's mix it up a little bit. Unfortunately, that's just not what we do. So, but I would find that very interesting. So now I want to take a small step back, just because of the fact that sitting here thinking about all these old Greek men, certainly all men, practicing, you don't have female doctors out here saving people. So just from your perspective, what is it like being a woman in classics studying ancient medicine, where you are essentially reading all these texts just by ancient men? And one thing that I think all women can sort of speak to is, I think we hate it when men try to diagnose women's problems when we all know men don't really know shit about women's problems.
Yeah.
So is it just really interesting to be a woman studying ancient medicine, reading all these things that some men have written about? Oh, this woman came to me today and I think I know what's wrong with her. Really? Do
Yeah.
you?
I mean, it's a great question. And you mentioned earlier that I work in gender and sexuality, and I've always seen my work in ancient medicine as informed by trying to imagine at a really broad philosophical scale the feminization of the body, the feminization of vulnerability, the ways in which feminization is a form of othering, racial othering, even in antiquity as well, and sexuality, and so forms ways in which normativity is social norms get taken up through medicine as a site that naturalizes forms of oppression. And so these have always been kind of large scale issues, as well as these questions of, knowledge production at the local level, like these medical writers, men encountering women. There'd been some really amazing work done by pioneering feminist scholars, Anne Hansen and Helen King and Aline Roussel and Véronique Dassin. There was a lot of important work done in the 90s, Leslie Dean Jones, around sex and gender in medicine. And in fact, medicine kind of first came up in classics as a site for doing sex and gender stuff. And so there was a lot of interesting work that when I came in to the field on questions of, say, female voices, were there female physicians, like is there a midwife, these kinds of questions that continue to be really interesting to me. And I continue to work with students on them. And I think particularly around the naturalization and normativity around, say, virginity and sereneness is an interesting point, where you're seeing the focalization through the society, through kind of biological thinking, through imagining what might be healthy for the woman, but it's sort of all overlaid with the instrumentalization of female bodies for reproduction. I mean, that's always what it is. So I think that the best way to kind of answer your question is, like, over the years, I didn't set out to become an expert in ancient medicine. I'm fascinated by the text. I'm fascinated by the philosophical questions. And my work is really, in dialogue with, increasingly, I think, work in biopolitics or critical theory or sex and gender studies, but they're really arcane texts. And I've been, it's difficult to work in communities where there's not even a basic understanding of sex and gender and gender and sexuality theory and things like that. And so I think a lot of times a kind of feminist perspective on these texts, which is just to say a way that acknowledges their deep investment in sex and gender and normativity, if that's absent and you're just sitting around talking about technicalities, right? It's made me look to other communities where I feel like I can be involved in the kind of knowledge making that is cognizant of questions of sex and gender and racial difference and human flourishing, that's fully attentive to that, rather than being done in a kind of isolation. So I think, the simple answer to your question is, yeah, like classics is still like a pretty conservative field, and it's pretty sexist. And if you do really arcane work, if you say Aristotle's a misogynist, like people be like, oh my God, no, like he's not a misogynist. And these are just some isolated examples where he says, women are deformed men. And it's like, I don't understand this position. Like, his whole metaphysics is based on the devaluation of the feminine and matter. If you can't take that on board and still go forward, what are you going to do? But I think the paradox then becomes, if you are a woman who's devoted a lot of your life and attention to studying this work, is it a form of self-hatred? Is it a form of, like, why would I study this guy who's such a misogynist? And I think that is a complicated question for someone like Sarah Brill in her new book, I think handles this really brilliantly around these questions. Like, what does it mean to engage with this work? And it has to be in order to think the present differently, as far as I'm concerned. That it really is where just doing historical work on these texts, like, I did it, I've done it. I believe in deep historical work because I believe it gets us out of the myopia of the present, but it can never be an end in itself, because at least for me, it's not, I want to spend my life that way. So I have a really strong commitment to the specificity of these texts, because we don't want them to just tell us what we want to hear, whether good or bad. I want to find the complexity in them. So they're not just straight up misogynistic. Like, we can understand, like, how these systems of thought, where they hit problems, where they puzzle over, like where they're trying to use, thinking about body and mind to work through questions of the human experience that are powerful. But they always, I think increasingly, I feel like I'm invested in building communities of readers in classics, but really outside of classics, artists. I work a lot with artists where, these texts are not canonical. They're not classical in the sense they're just given, like they're sites for imagining the present differently.
And I think most people would notice it's not, I mean, medicine is its own sort of, I would consider it separate, just because obviously when you're doing medicine, it's going to have to be for everyone. So you can't just ignore women or women's voices. But I'm just noticing there is currently in the field, I mean, I know it's been changing and it's better, but for things like, I mean, we have some, I would say, pioneering women who've done translations there's Emily Wilson, who did the Odyssey. There are several authors like Natalie Haynes, where she sort of reimagined Euripides' Trojan Women with her new book, A Thousand Ships. And as I look at the sort of reception that women like that get when they sort of take everything we have from these male sources and say, okay, well, I'm going to look at the female voices here because they did exist. They just weren't covered. The reactions go from, this is great, we really need to see this, to hear this, to straight up, no, why would you do that? You can't do that. This is terrible. So obviously medicine is very different, but I don't know, like, is there ever going to be a way where, I mean, is gender studies for like the ancient world, is that going to keep growing and become bigger and bigger as more women decide, I'm going to just tackle this stuff that all these men do, like, fuck it, whatever, I'm just going to do it? Is it going to grow? Is it going to grow that field? Is it going to expand into some of these other sort of sub-disciplines within the field? Or, what kind of headwinds do you see as a woman in classics? Or do you not see anything changing?
I think it's definitely changing in that the number of students coming to this material who are explicitly interested in queer theory, gender and sexuality studies, reception has changed the field profoundly. That I do think just at the moment where you feel like it's done, this is a hopeless project, this is a sexist field, and it's not, and it's not philosophically exciting. It's not interested in theorizing itself. That's a very frustrating aspect of classics. Just at that moment, then it does feel like there's a generation of women and queer scholars and scholars who are just non-binary and trying to think, okay, what if we just started rebuilding this world from our own perspective, and a willingness to imagine new forms of scholarship and public work. And I mean, that was what I had sort of found my way to with my collaborations with artists and doing exhibition work. And that's, I think there are feedback loops with different communities that can be sustaining for the kind of work you need to do in classics to change the field, but that can be incredibly exhausting and tiring and depressing because it changes slowly. A lot of the work is invisible, with the invisibilization of so much labor of women everywhere, and particularly structural labor. That's the labor that has to do, but I mean, like a lot of it is behind the scenes, and then women's scholarship is often effaced, not cited, in the field. Like we continue to reproduce this kind of, the male scholars who are loudest. And I think you get really depressed. So I'm kind of wondering here, because it's Friday afternoon, but like every time I say I'm done with this field, I didn't choose to be in it. I came out of comparative literature. I've got a ton of people I talk to who I love talking to. And increasingly, like, it's the artists I'm collaborating with are amazing, but I'm just going to leave. And I love the material. Like, the problem is this big book that I'm working on, this sympathy book. Like, I love the material and I do want to finish this big book, but I would love to have a community of people who are working on this material in ways that are exciting and resonant, where it's people that I can talk to, where we share a sense of if you're talking about race or you're talking about gender or sexuality, like, you're not doing identity politics. You don't lack humanist imagination. Like, somehow you have to prove that you know what the dative is in order to say something next, even if, the people who know what the dative is can't think their way out of a paper bag. Like, that's fine. But like, just when you're ready to give up, you think, oh, but I don't want to abandon the ancient material to the pedants. And I fought this hard, and, why give up now? So I guess what I would say is community is crucial. Collaboration is crucial. There's a lot of talk about collaboration in the humanities, and people imagine these big, large scale grants. And, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about intellectual friendships. I'm talking about generosity. I'm talking about bonds of mentorship and mutual aid within the academy, which is about supporting not just marginalized identities, which is necessary, but like combating the microaggressions every day of fighting a system that's decided like you're not as smart as everyone else, just that's very difficult. And then fighting to say I'm intelligent because I work on these fields that you don't recognize as knowledge. Now I'm getting into I do a lot of interdisciplinary work. And one of the things I came to see, I ran the interdisciplinary doctoral program in the humanities at Princeton for 4 years. And my work is it's, like you said, it looks like it's all over the place because for me, it's all kind of unified, but I'm constantly using what I call different knowledge technologies or epistemic technologies. It's a commitment to perspectivalism. And what I learned about doing interdisciplinary work in the institution is there's a politics of knowledge. Like when Princeton's president says, we're not going to let people concentrate in gender and sexuality studies because it's premature. I'm like, what is going on here? There is a valuation embedded in the structures of these institutions, big endowments and, old scale humanities that don't want to change, but they're hoarding resources, and the most exciting forms of knowledge production continue to be marginalized. And so the people who are doing them continue to be marginalized because they're starved of resources and they're treated as though they're not doing real scholarship, or you have to somehow go do real scholarship and then you'll be allowed to do gender and sexuality, or then you'll be allowed to do, critical race theory or queer theory. So I think that there's a shift happening where I would hope we could get away from the assumption that there's a canon of texts, and as long as you know these texts and you can read them in some kind of, traditional philological way, that's sufficient, to recognizing that we could have a community of scholars where people are pursuing their own interests in a way. And we appreciate all those perspectives and we value them all, and that we all need to be committed to making the field accessible, not because we're just come into this, hermetic white male, country club, but let's think who this we is, and let's think about all of these perspectives as equally valuable.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And it's okay if you don't have anything a lot
to
say
rant
about it.
I have a lot to say. I don't know if that was even the best.
Oh no, I think it's all very important. And so just, as a young woman in classics who, for right now, after I graduated, I knew I didn't want to go right into grad school. I probably couldn't because of the language requirement. So it gave me time to sort of go into the working world, get experience, really think about who I am, what I want, get a critical look at the field that I've devoted most of my educational life to so far. And a lot of it seems daunting. A lot of people ask me all the time, oh, do you ever think you might want to go on? You could still try to go to grad school for classics, study something you like. And I say, truthfully, I don't know. There's a lot to like. I love the material. I do. I'm not going to lie about that. But there's also a lot that sometimes can seem like such a barrier. So as someone who maybe at one point in my life wanted to sort of be sort of where you are now, do you have any advice for any young women in classics who are sort of in my position, whether they're still in school or recently graduated? How did you do it? How did you persevere and make it to where you are when you've talked about, hitting this wall of, maybe I should just get out. Maybe I can just be okay with my experience that I've accrued and then just go into something else.
Yeah. I think it's really important going in to be clear about what you want out of going to graduate school. And I say that not just in the sense of, oh yeah, there's no jobs. There are still some jobs, but it's more about being clear about your own, what you know. You already know a lot about antiquity, and you know a lot about the world and thinking. And a lot of times when you talk about, oh, you don't have the languages, or, we think about what, people are less prepared for graduate school and classics. It's not that they weren't doing anything. They often have all these forms of knowledge that they've acquired through embodied experience, through, studying sociology or studying art history. That is what we need in classics right now in order to build the field. And I think, what happens when you go to graduate school in classics is there is this kind of, yes, you have to learn the languages in most programs now. I think there are ways of doing reception. I think there are ways of doing classics that you wouldn't need the languages. But all of this is changing quickly. And so I always think of it as know what you want or think you want, and you don't know everything, right? Because you're not there yet. And so keep building in that loop for yourself where you're keeping front and center what's valuable to you. Classics is a field that has valuation built into its name. And it has that kind of, dull hitting of you, like, oh no, this is classics. And it will beat out of you your own sense of ownership of the material or the field in ways that I find pernicious. And I think that holding out your own relationship and your own conditions of valuing this material and continually revisiting them is something that's really crucial. The other thing I would say is, so I'm really interested in institutions. I think a lot of power, we focus on individuals. A lot of it is structure. And it's funny, I have a friend, she's a sculptor who runs the program of visual arts at Princeton. And I like talking to her because she talks about institution building as like sculpture. And, some of it is bureaucratic and you could lose your life in it, but understanding how structures work allow you to be tactical within them and to change them sometimes and to move. And so I always tell my students, build the world you want to live in. And you can't do that alone. That's where collaboration is absolutely key. But it's about understanding, we can burn it all down. And I think classics as a field, I don't know what its value is, but I'm actually just much more interested in how do you do world building? How do you build, new communities? And a lot of my own work has been focused on that question of how do you build a conversation in a workshop, in a seminar, in an exhibition? And I think that I wish that we thought about the field that way, that we imagine that, new scholars coming in saw this as a moment of co-creation, and that we were all recognizing that we're at a moment of the discipline where I think that's its future. And in my optimistic moments, I think, great. But then I say optimistic, the problem is know how institutions work. But to go back to what I started with, you are not the institution, you are not the field, you are not the discipline. The academy is like a monastery. It's like it will eat you alive in terms of the way that it imagines who you are, what your value is. It won't give you an outside to your life. And the difficult thing of doing institutional work is not to let the institution consume you, to maintain maintain intellectual friendships outside the institution, people in your community, people that you're talking to, and see that as really crucial to the kind of work you're doing. So that's a kind of feedback loop that I think is really important.
Yeah. I love how you termed that, the world building, like thinking about classics as world building and opening up, being more inclusive, building better habits. I love that for many reasons, I would say, too many to count. But one of them is one thing that I often talk about when it comes to representations of the ancient world, building interest, trying to actively get more creative people interested in and to come to the field. One of what I found most interesting recruiting grounds for that comes from the world of entertainment, just because there's that mix of what do we like? We like stories. Where do stories come from? They come from mythology. Oh, that's ancient stuff. And so any kind of media we have today comes from that. It's a very long conveyor belt sort of. And a lot of people don't connect the importance of the classical world to media. And so what we have are popular films and TV shows where, sometimes we show sort of accurate things and sometimes we don't. And I found they're really bad at sort of talking to each other as industries, as fields. Oh, we can help you. We can help you do a lot of things. Do you want to make really entertaining, engaging things that, oh, hey, also happen to be historically accurate? Would that make somebody say, hey, I saw this movie because I love movies. I learned a really cool thing about the ancient world. Now I want to go study that. There's not a process to sort of build that up. And so there's so many different examples, and I don't have time to go into all of them, and I probably wouldn't be able to cover all of them anyway, so I won't try. But I would say there are certain things. I know when we talk about reception studies, I think one of the most studied ancient figures, Homer, obviously, and studying and reading Homer has led to takeoffs of his of his epic poems. So we have things like the Brad Pitt Troy or the Netflix miniseries Troy Fall of the City. Both are very interesting, I would say. But as we know, they don't represent everything perfectly. Some better than others. When it comes to sort of the stuff that you study, your fields, when you see movies or TV shows that are, or even if they can be plays or read them in books. But when we see how do we represent women in the ancient world in things that are supposed to be sort of historically accurate, but kind of not because, hey, entertainment value. I don't know. What do you think when you see some of these things and as a scholar of gender studies and you say, oh, well, okay, there aren't many women in something like the big 300 movie, right? There's like one woman in there and then she's all on screen for all of 5 seconds.
Yeah.
How do we change that? Because I think that would also help in terms of world building, expand the world beyond just men.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, there's a way in which there's a kind of collusive relationship between mythology and Hollywood in whose voices it privileges, who's, going to be the star of an action movie and so on and so forth. And so it's in a way, you kind of get your entertainment value and then you get a kind of validation of gender stereotypes because, that's just the way it was. So I think that it is a challenge. And I like I said, I know, let me answer it in a couple ways. If I could just respond, because I'm going to touch on the gender question, we'll come back to it. But when you mentioned Troy, and I was thinking a long time ago, I used to teach, when I would teach Epic, I would show my students Troy and then Brother, Where Art Thou? And I loved that because it helped them see things about adaptation, about what it meant to get at the spirit of a work or to respond to the work that's not just historical recreation and, the absence of the gods from Troy. It helped them understand what work the gods were doing in the Iliad. Because when you just see the Iliad, you think, oh, what are these gods doing here? And then you kind of see an attempt to sort of represent it without it. And they think, oh, I see what's happening. And Brother, Where Art Thou, I think, is just a brilliant adaptation of like the spirit of the Odyssey. It's much more creative, but it also feels much more true. And so I think doing that kind of work can help students see that you can engage with the ancient world in a way that doesn't mean period costumes. It can mean getting at mythic structures, and mythic structures are inherently malleable. They're inherently made for recreation. And that's what tragedy is in relationship to, myth, is it's constantly innovating. It's constantly finding new perspectives. It's constantly inverting power dynamics in order to vocalize the really core issues that mythology is about, in family, kinship, violence, sexual violence, power, suffering, helplessness. I mean, I love tragedy because it's about these human issues that we don't have structures in our society to really get at with the same level of intensity. And yet built into them is that sense of perspectival malleability in a way that the epic, recreation or the 400 promotes a version of the ancient world that I think, I'm not that interested in. But I said, one thing I think about a lot, because when you first did popular culture, I do work with a lot of artists. And so I think a lot about, the kind of more experimental adaptations and theater. And there too, I think you can do really interesting things with the open, more classical adaptation versus like a really innovative or playful adaptation, which is inspired by the story, but may not even seem to be, related to it in the same way. So I'm thinking, some of the classical versions I've seen of Trojan women, to mention Trojan women, nobody knows what to do with the chorus. They're technically great, but, the kind of all the mourning is hard to pull off because we don't really have a way to translate it in terms of the registers and so on and so forth. And then I think of someone like a collaborator I work with, Isabel Lewis, who's engaged with Plato's Symposium to reimagine performance. I mean, she started in theater and dance and is inverting the whole notion of what it means to be on stage and what it means to be in a kind of open-ended dialogue with people around you to produce a conversation, a philosophical conversation, but that's oriented around performance. And, to me, that's like at the heart of what is going on in the 5th century in terms of mythic thought encountering philosophy, for example. But I think too, I realize the popular culture. I mean, my son is 7, my daughter is 4. And when we start, when they were younger, I mean, when my son, maybe a few years ago, we would go hiking and I had to entertain him and I started telling him myths. Like that's what I had. I just don't have the energy to make up stories. And that has been amazing to me because he loves them. I'm constantly encountering, the prevalence of rape within these stories, the prevalence of violence of all kinds. Even telling the myths of Heracles, like I would have to say, are we going to do the one where he tames the monsters? Or are we going to do the one where he kills the monsters? Like I would worry about the kinds of structures of narrative that I was giving to him, but he loved them because they're stories, and he would start to make up his own myths. And so I could see that, the malleability. And I was thinking, how can I give this to him as the good parts of this inheritance, what you were talking about as myth, as a kind of element of storytelling, without the bad parts, by which I mean the ways in which so many myths do objectify women, do glorify violence. And then also, increasingly I became worried. I mean, this was a kid, like, okay, everybody thinks it's funny. Like, I think it's funny. I taught him to say parthenogenesis at quite a young age, and autodidact is his new favorite. He was talking about that. We were looking at some birds. He was like, those birds are autodidacts. I was like, yeah, they are. But like, the son of a classicist, like I'm also thinking about the double-edged weapon of like mythology as cultural capital. And, I came from a very middle-class background, and coming to Columbia, I was very acutely aware of classics as cultural capital. Or I think maybe I wasn't aware. I became aware of how it exercised power over me in that way. So I think about what I'm doing, giving him mythic vocabularies in a world where he goes to a public school in Washington Heights, how can that be a site for imagining with his friends rather than a marker of class difference, for example? So that's been a really ongoing site of kind of real world thinking about popular culture.
Yeah. Oh, I heartily approve of telling children myths at a young age, because neither of my parents really were big into history. My mom loves music, and she was in voiceover, and my dad's a lawyer. So unfortunately, I was not exposed to anything from them directly. I had to seek out everything myself.
And
how did I? Oh goodness. It's funny. I don't know what age or how young, because I've always just loved storytelling. I've loved it. I don't think I necessarily started out with like actual Greek or Roman mythology. It was storytelling. And then when I got to be a little older, probably 6 or 7, I finally discovered, hey, actually, this is mythology. And I had a wild imagination. And then I think it was all finally put together when I got to 6th grade. I had a fabulous teacher it was our ancient world year. So she did this really imaginative thing where I'm going to let you bring a bed sheet into class, make it into a toga. Everyone's going to choose like a fake Greek name that you're going to use with your classmates. And then the way the classroom was set up was you had 5 tables that you could fit like 5 students at. And each table then became a different Greek city-state. And then we would have like inter-class competitions. So it was really clever and brilliant. And at the end of that year, I just said, oh gosh, I have to learn more. I have to study more. I have to read more about the ancient world. And then I just kept going. It was kind of self-study. And then
you're an autodidact.
Yeah, exactly. And then I got to college and I didn't know what classics was even then, but I knew anthropology and history were my closest shots. So I went to see the undergrad advisors for each one. I said, hey, tell me where I'm going. So then I would sit and explain to them, this is what I like. This is what I'm good at. Tell me what I do. And they said, oh, go to classics. Here's the email for the advisor. Here, go have fun and be great. And so I emailed him and fell into classics right freshman year, and then could not have been happier. I stayed the course, and here I am today. But it's definitely influenced everything I do in life. I was really interested in like ancient political thought, and I felt so sad because I only scratched the surface of that. But when I graduated, I went right into politics. So, that's just another arm that you can use a classical background for. But I would very much like to go back to grad school if I can.
I can say, I always recommend people don't go straight to grad school. I think it's super important to do something out in the world so that it goes back to what I said. So you know what you're going for. It's not just, I'm good at this, I like to be in school, but you have a sense of the world you're operating in. So that's great.
Yeah. And I don't know if I'm realistically ever going to be able to go to grad school for classics. I mean, that's a lot of languages that now I'm like, oh no, I've got to find a ways to learn. It's expensive, blah, blah, blah. But just in the immediate future, I found there's so many different ways that I can apply my background. And one of them was I love politics and I love Greece. So how do I combine them? And I found a program at the University of Athens, and there I'm going to be able to study ethnic Greek nationalism. And so I'm really excited because I'm going to get to study sort of the whole history of Greece as a nation. So hopefully we're going to go back to the ancient times and see how nationalism for each city state essentially, and how that sort of evolved through the years into the modern iteration. So I'm just essentially combining the culture that I love, the people I love, and the background that I've come from, but into a very practical, useful ability of being able to sort of hopefully at the end of that be able to really discuss nationalism. What is it? How do we, how does it live? How does it survive? How has it changed through the years? So I'm really excited. I've been able to sort of carve a spot for myself, and who knows? After I get that master's, hopefully in a year or two, maybe I'll be convinced and find a way to get back into classics or keep going with what I'm doing and just bring classical elements to it. Yeah, I don't know. It's I'm moving there. I sort of don't know what I'm doing at any moment, so I just sort of live day to day and say, okay, let's wake up today and how can I infuse classics into my everyday life, into things that I work on, think about.
But I love going through the modern Greek material, which I came to very late, and it should be taught. I mean, we need to understand the ways in which, classics as a discipline formed. It's definitely very linked to nationalism. It's part of a larger story about nationalism, the humanities. And I think in a way you may learn much more than you would going the traditional classics route. And then, you can find your way back to the text, or as you say, work with them as you want to work with them. But, there's more programs that are becoming more interdisciplinary. I think Chicago's program, UCLA, I think Penn is pretty interdisciplinary. But that's, to me, for students with really broad interests, or I want to say broad interests who are really theoretical interests and interest in reception, you have to pick the right program, because that you want to be in a place where you can really drill down on what you're most interested in learning. And that's really crucial. So
yeah, I've always been a huge proponent for the more interdisciplinary aspect of classics. I know a lot of people would just say, no, I think I prefer just going into it as a field and then studying some strand within it. And I've always been more in the more cutting edge revolutionary aspect of, well, what if I went into this modern program, but then just like most of my source material was the ancient material, so that I do get this hybrid of I'm using all the classical materials, but applying it to contemporary issues. And that's usually where my focus tends to be. I'm always looking at the practical applicability sort of aspect of classics. And that's just a huge part of what I spend my time also talking to other people about, which is, it is very important to study this stuff. But as we're trying to pull this subject into the future, I think that's not going to happen unless we also attach some element of, okay, how do we use it in contemporary, life? How do we put this in perspective for contemporary problems? Because obviously we don't face the same problems that the ancients did, but I would argue we have a lot of very similar ones. So, why not study the past? Okay, it's not the same thing, but I'm sure a lot of the solutions or the things you shouldn't do, those are pretty important for us. Just kind of like, as we were talking about earlier, the evolution of medicine, right? And how we think about medical ethics. Same issues, very different technological systems, blah, blah, blah. Still very applicable. We should study them all together. I don't know why we don't do that more. But sometimes there just seems not to be that appetite.
Yeah. And I think that's where the critical, we need to do it critically. This is starting to come to the field. I was in a committee call earlier today, but if we want to talk about the relevance of classics, the kind of work you're doing is crucial, because we can't be all sophisticated behind closed doors and then go and say, yeah, study us. It's the foundations of Western civilization. As somebody who's written a lot on big concepts, I'm very aware of those narratives. And I think the bigness of them is not wrong. They're complicated stories, but how we tell them and being critical about the history is we can't go on without that element. And so, when what you're doing with the podcast, I think is, really an example of building out the world you want to see. You wanted to create these conversations, you put a structure in place, and, it's really great. So congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. I never thought of myself as somebody who would be attempting to tackle an issue as big as accessibility to the field. And I never thought of myself particularly as someone who I would never call myself an expert in outreach, whatever that means. But when the opportunity presented myself, I saw it as a crucial opportunity to help the field out and those of us who are in it. Just because I don't know. I've always thought that classics as a field just does a terrible job of talking about ourselves and do very little outreach to other people. And we don't really spend time talking about the practical applicability of it, which is, that's fine. But people need to do it. So if I can contribute to that in any way, I like to.
Absolutely.
Just because I've gotten into some friendly debates with people all the time about this, is when you see symbols from the ancient world, especially within medicine, like the caduceus and the rod of Asclepius, when you see in our modern culture the fact that on all of our ambulances, they're using the wrong staff. Does that bother you at all? Because it does. I've learned to not let it bother me, but just as someone who knows ancient symbols, I see that and I'm like, well, that's wrong, because that's what Hermes uses, and that's sending the wrong message. You don't want him to ferry you to the underworld. You don't want to die. Like, why are we not using Asclepius's rod?
Yeah, I think we all have our own. Like, I get really upset, and this is like a different thing. Like when people talk about the beginning of anatomy and with Vesalius as the beginning of modern medicine. So you find that a lot. That really irritates me, because you have systematic I know it's not the same as a symbol, but it's like something that circulates and I'm always like, no, it's not. It's Ptolemaic Alexandria. Like, it's not ancient and modern. Like, I get really upset at like certain ways of dividing up ancient and modern that bother me. Or sometimes the ways Hippocrates is introduced as like, the first physician will sometimes irritate me. But yeah, it's funny. Like, I remember Reginald Foster. So I took his Latin course many years ago in Rome. Do you know him? He's the guy who did spoken Latin at the Vatican, and he passed away recently from COVID. I mean, he was in his 80s, but like, I remember him telling this story of passing this guy with I think it was his parents, he's like a college student, like, and they're in front of the Pantheon, and he's like pointing to the Latin inscription, and he's like, we don't know what this says. And Reginald's like, what? Some of us know what this says. It's like, then we have this weird arcane knowledge that we could, decipher your inscriptions and your symbols on your ambulances.
This is honestly, it's why I love classicists so much, because we are the people with the weird skills where nobody asked us for our opinion on a certain thing. If you see it on a building, on a poster, anything, and then we just go, hey, if you've ever wanted to meet someone with just like a really weird skill that most people would just be like, wait, what? Yeah. That's us. Hey, I can do that. I can do this. I have an Egyptologist friend who he always says that his weird skill is just slap any picture of a coffin in front of his face and he'll tell you exactly what dynasty, what time period, almost right to the year. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. That's a weird skill that no one I know has. Like, you show me a coffin, I just go, ooh, it's pretty. That's a great skill. And yes, so at the end of each podcast episode, I ask every guest to read Shelley's version of Ozymandias. And after you read it, you don't have to, I'm not expecting you to just sort of have a whole thing on it. Just, I always like to get just a snapshot in time of your quick thoughts of,
okay, good.
Does it speak to you? What does this poem mean? What are the central themes?
Good. And I didn't read it in advance. Okay. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things. the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal, these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. You know, it's funny because I'm teaching my medicine. Well, so I'm not teaching my medicine class. I'm teaching my nature class. And I was thinking, we were talking about Francesca Rockberg's book, Before Nature, and cuneiform. She talked about cuneiform culture. And cuneiform culture is 2 millennia, the last 2 millennia BCE. And I think we're just this, even in imperial time, we're such a small sliver of the American empire. And I do think that it can be, it's a cliche. Obviously, it's a cliche that it's humbling, but like the time scales that we're operating within right now feel particularly compressed because we're living through the pandemic. It's very moment to moment. It seems like we're in this state of acute crisis, and it feels like apocalyptic. It feels like, the end of this, climate change and systemic collapse and societal collapse. And I think that, somehow recognizing that huge span of time that you're operating within, it's not just humbling. I mean, I was talking earlier about the problem with the pandemic right now is that there's so much harm that's become visible, and you want to fix it. And we want people to fix it, and particularly people in power. Being at a place like Princeton, you feel like you need to do everything you can to try to address problems of the institution, to use the power you have to change the world. But we're exhausted. And I think that kind of recognition that I was talking about earlier about caregiving work, and the recognition that there's a lot of structural harm made by humans who are pretty fucked up creatures, and we always have been. And the heroism associated with saving it all, you can deal with the magnitude of the crises without devaluing the work you do locally, I think, to care for those things. And it's that kind of scaling down, which I think is important right now.
Yeah, I mean, the poem is very short. Obviously, it's not anything like Homer, of course. But I think it is nice because it is a very short commentary, on power. I think it's a memento mori, personally, but the working definition that I like to go off of is that it's a look at human hubris along with the ephemeral nature of power, all power. And if I consider it that way, there's so many different iterations that it could take that come to my mind, just in terms of what kind of things do we see in modern day right now that think they're so great that in 1,000 years, who knows what will happen to them. So kind of with that working definition, the very last question that I ask every guest, because I love the difference in answers and opinions that I get. If we consider the poem to be commentary on power and hubris, is there anything in our modern society today, right now, that is like a modern Ozymandias? Is there such a thing as a modern Ozymandias?
It's funny because the first answer that came to mind is maybe symptomatic of what I was saying earlier. I mean, I was thinking of Mar-a-Lago or something like that, or some Trumpian sign. And then I thought, that's the scale problem we have, is we have these big crises, but we don't have kings in the same way. I mean, we do, but they seem so, Trump he comes to mind because he was a perversion of a culture, which is, should be avowedly democratic. And so the kind of disconnect between, the kind of funniness of thinking of him, but also there's something so awful about it, that it feels like the fact that the disanalogy and the analogy both point to the real fear that Trump posed to democracy and an American empire, which won't be built on forms of white nationalism. But then, he posed a fear, but then also, he's so small. It's not a good answer. I can't think of it. Maybe the Hollywood sign.
That's totally possible. I mean, there is no one answer, and there is no answer that's better than the other, which is something that I was shocked to learn that that's actually kind of the point of asking the question, which is there is no great answer. When I first started asking the question, I thought, okay, I'm probably going to get a lot of the same answers, and we're going to see a theme here. No, because every answer is so different. One of my favorites was a former professor of mine at Mizzou, who I interviewed, and he said his example was a casino, an old casino in Atlantic City. We thought those would last forever. They're all abandoned now. They're just sort of sitting there chilling, just gone. I think somebody said capitalism. Somebody said technology. So yeah, it could be a million things. It's just a really sort of meta question that I like to ask, because it's going to be so different for everyone. And it's a reflection of people's own opinions, what they study, how they study it. So that's kind of why I've started asking.
Yeah, and the fluidity, I mean, particularly right now around power and autocratic power, it was Trump, and now it's not, and that it's a register problem, right? Like, we didn't know how to gauge what he represented, and I think we still don't.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, the simple answer would be, oh yeah, well, Ozymandias, the poem was about a man, so obviously I should choose a human. So I think I was initially expecting a lot of Trump and Putin's and things like that, but the majority of answers actually have not been people, which...
Yeah. It's like the Hollywood sign, when you step back and you think, it's a hard question.
Yeah. But thank you for agreeing to join me at the end of your day.
I'm glad we finally managed to do it. And I thought I can't put you off again. And I thought, I'll only last an hour, but I'm quite wordy, and I'm glad to hear a little bit about what brought you to the project.
Trireme Transit is now departing ancient Odyssey. Next stop is Present Ponderings. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.